So good afternoon and welcome to our panel discussion today on the crisis in Syria and Russian intervention in Syria. So we are pleased to have three specialists today with us. First of all, I'll introduce myself. My name is Jeff Pennington. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies. And on behalf of ICES and the Center for Middle East Studies, the two centers on campus which are bringing you this panel discussion today, I would just like to go ahead and introduce our three speakers. I'll introduce them in the order that they'll be speaking, and then afterwards we'll open up the floor to Q&A. At the time of Q&A, we have one microphone here, so if you would just, when we open the floor for questions, come up, line up behind the microphone, answer your question, and sit down, then the speakers will be able to address the questions. So our first speaker today is Professor Fred Lawson, who is the department head, or the head of the government department at Mills College in Oakland. Professor Lawson holds a BA from Indiana University and his MA and PhD from the University of California at Los Angeles. He is a specialist on the Middle East and particularly on Syria and the Gulf states. He has numerous articles to his name. I would just like to point out three publications that he's written in the recent past. One, Transformations of Regional Economic Governance in the Gulf Cooperation Council. Another, Global Security Watch, Syria. And a third, Why Syria Goes to War, 30 Years of Confrontation. Following Professor Lawson will be Professor Mark Galeotti, who is Professor of Global Affairs at NYU's New York University's SPS Center for Global Affairs, where he is the head of its transnational security program and an expert on Russian security and politics, transnational crime, and intelligence affairs. He read history at Robinson College and Cambridge University, and then took his doctorate in politics at London School of Economics. He is also widely published and has a number of books to his name, including most recently Russia's Wars in Chechnya and Spetsnaz, Russian Special Forces, and has a forthcoming book including Vori, Russian Organized Crime. And our third speaker today is our very own, meaning here at Berkeley's, Dr. Edward Walker. He is the Executive Director of the Berkeley Program in Eurasian and East European Studies, and also adjunct professor in the Department of Political Science here. He holds an BA from Harvard, and his PhD is from Columbia University. He too is the author of numerous articles, two books, one is the edited Minorities, Mullahs, and Modernity, Reshaping Community in the Former Soviet Union, and his monograph, Dissolution, Sovereignty, and the Breakup of the Soviet Union. And most recently, he's been blogging. He's an avid blogger, and you can find him at eurasiangeopolitics.com. So without further ado, I'll turn the floor over to Professor Lawson.
Thanks. By the fall of 2015, it looked as if Syria's 5-year-old civil war had ground into a stubborn stalemate. Government troops remained in control of the area around the capital city of Damascus, retained control of the hills of the Mediterranean coast, and were in charge of the major cities of central Syria, Homs, Hama, and the western part of Aleppo. The Kurdish Democratic Union Party was in charge of 3 large zones along the Turkish border, and the Islamic State was deeply entrenched in the provincial city of Raqqa in the middle part of the country, with a string of outposts along the Euphrates River and in the eastern desert, in the desert areas to the east of Hama and Homs. So from 30,000 feet, not much had changed over the previous 8 or 12 months. If we drop down to tree level, however, 5 distinct theaters of battle come into view. And I'd like to say a few words today about 3 of those areas of battle. in the rugged countryside west of Aleppo, between Aleppo and the hills of the coast, the spring of 2015 brought the announcement that two of the major guerrilla organizations had amalgamated. The Battalions of the Free of Syria and the Hawks of Syria joined together to form a new military organization in the West, and analysts expected that this new organization would challenge Syria's branch of al-Qaeda, known as the Assistance Front, and become a rival of the Assistance Front in the hills of western Syria. But instead of doing this, the new joint command, called the Army of Conquest, instead joined together with the Assistance Front to take control of the provincial capital of Idlib, just outside Aleppo, and set up a local administration under the control of al-Qaeda's local branch. The Assistance Front immediately announced that this city would be run according to strict Islamic principles and be run as an emirate, as a rival to the emirate that Islamic State had set up in Raqqa in the middle part of the country. The Army of Conquest then went on to take charge of the next town over, Jisr al-Shughur. This map doesn't show Jisr al-Shughur, just outside Idlib, and then threatened to push west into the Alawi-dominated hills along the coast. Finding itself squeezed out of the areas west of Aleppo, the Islamic State in mid-May struck south through the desert in the direction of the town of Tadmur and seized control of the tourist town at Palmyra. So what we see in this battlefield west of Aleppo is that the Islamic State gets thrown out of the district by the Assistance Front and is challenged by a new joint organization made up of rival Islamist militias. In the northern metropolis of Aleppo, fighting also raged in the spring and summer of 2015. The Army of Conquest was active to the west part of the city, but the Islamic State gradually moved toward the eastern part of Aleppo and engaged the Army of Conquest in the northern outskirts of the city. The Army of Conquest captured a couple of important military bases around Aleppo in July and August. And when the Army of Conquest captured those military bases, the Army of Conquest gradually began to break up from within, and the Assistance Front became challenged by rival organizations inside that umbrella organization. By early August of 2015, the Islamic State was active along the Turkish border to the north of Aleppo, challenging a couple of the border crossings between Syria and Turkey. And these tactical advances on the part of the Islamic State in early August led France in mid-September to announce that France was going to begin carrying out airstrikes against the Islamic State in its heartland around Raqqa in the middle part of the country. The third battlefront that I want to say a couple of words about concerns the far northeastern part of the country. In the far northeastern regions of Syria in the spring and summer of 2015, Kurdish forces steadily gained ground and took territory back from the Islamic State. The major Kurdish organization, the Popular Protection Units, had blocked the Islamic State from gaining control of the border town at Ain al-Arab in January of 2015, and after stopping Islamic State from taking control of Ain al-Arab, the Popular Protection Units then moved south in the direction of Tel Tamer and in the direction of Tel Abyad along the northern parts of Syria. Major battles took place between the Popular Protection Units and Islamic State in early June and on into July. The Kurdish forces in June and July were supported by aircraft from the Syrian government air force. The Islamic State retaliated against these advances by striking out against the large eastern city of Hasaki in early August, and the Islamic State also tried to push the Kurdish forces back toward the northern border, toward Syria. But Kurdish organizations parried these attacks, sometimes with support from Turkish armed forces, prevented the Islamic State from regaining some of the territory that it was gradually pushed away from. By August of 2015, Kurdish forces were trying repeatedly to cross the Euphrates River to attack the major border town of Jarablus, which continues to be occupied by the Islamic State, but each time Kurdish forces have tried to push Islamic State out of Jarablus, they have come under fire from Turkish artillery north of the border. The Turks have consistently tried to block the Kurds from advancing along the Turkish border. I say all this as background because it was under these circumstances that Russia deployed military advisors to an airfield outside Latakia on the coast in early September of 2015. By mid-September, dozens of Russian tanks and armored personnel carriers had arrived at this military airfield. On the 19th of September, cadres of one of the Islamist militias that is active around Damascus fired a handful of rockets at the Russian forces pouring into the military airfield in Latakia. And this group, known as the Army of Islam, publicly announced war on all Russian forces operating inside Syria. Not only did the Army of Islam immediately take a position firmly opposed to Russian intervention, but the mainstream external leadership of the opposition, the National Coalition of Revolutionary and Opposition Forces, also publicly decried what the coalition called direct Russian military intervention in the fighting. Russian aircraft carried out their first airstrike inside Syria at the end of September, and when the Russian planes actually did drop bombs inside the country, the first targets were Islamist formations between the city of Hama and Homs in the area around Talbisa and Aurastan. The Russian troops therefore struck at independent Islamist militias, including the Hawks of the Mountain Brigade and Turkmen militias in that district and in the hills along the Turkish border. By the beginning of October, there were reports that Iranian fighters were coming into Syria from Iraq. These Iranian fighters were taking up positions around Homs in order to carry out military operations along the Lebanese border and slowly march in the direction of the northwest part of the country. By early October, there are good reports that some 700 Chechen fighters also entered Syria from neighboring Iraq. These Chechen fighters took up positions in the fertile agricultural area north of Hama, known as the Ghab Plain, to resist government offensives coming up from Homs. The convergence of government offensive coming up north from Hama and Islamic State activities out in the desert prompted 41 of the Islamist militias operating between Hama and Aleppo to issue a statement where they pledged to work together against the Russians and push the Russians out of the country. Nevertheless, all during October and early November, government forces steadily pushed north of Hama and in the direction of Idlib. In the face of this government offensive, Kurdish forces operating in the northeast part of the country formed a coalition with a dozen independent militias operating in the northeast to form a new broad-based organization in the northeast that calls itself the Democratic Forces of Syria. The Democratic Forces of Syria is a broad, heterogeneous umbrella organization that consists not only of the major Kurdish militia, but also consists of the remnants of the old Free Syrian Army Brigade that was present in Raqqa before Islamic State came, that calls itself the Raqqa Revolutionaries Front. It includes a relatively large a Syrian militia, the Syriac Military Council, and it includes a number of formations of Syrian Turkmen that have formed independent militias that are largely active in the area along the Turkish border, but there are some Turkmen villages up in the north part of the country as well that are part of this new Democratic Forces of Syria coalition. This new Democratic Forces of Syria then launched a campaign to drive Islamic State out of this broad area of Hasaki province. And on the 12th of November, the Democratic Forces of Syria managed to dislodge Islamic State cadres from the important crossroads town of Al-Hol near the border with Iraq. Around Aleppo, the various Islamic militias have fallen out with one another. In October and November, there are splits in the opposition forces. The rivalries among different opposition forces have made it possible for government troops and Hezbollah fighters from the Lebanese Islamist movement Party of God to make advances in the direction of Aleppo. As government forces have pushed in the direction of Aleppo, smaller independent militias around Idlib have also declared their membership in the Democratic Forces of Syria. The Democratic Forces of Syria coalition, therefore, is gaining strength in the direction of Idlib and Aleppo as well, and especially among the Turkmen militias along the border with Hatay. By mid-November, Russia was deploying strategic bombers operating out of the southern part of Russia that, if I understand correctly, dropped down across Iranian airspace and Iraqi airspace to come into Syria more or less from the south. And these strategic bombings in the middle part of November targeted Islamic State positions in Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor. But meanwhile, up in the area along the Turkish border, Turkmen militias, broadly aligned with the democratic forces, were gradually pushing remnants of Islamic State cadres out of villages north and northwest of Aleppo. And the Turkmen militias operating up in the north along the Hatay border were often given tactical support by the Turkish Air Force. The Turkish Air Force claimed that this operation was the first step in the direction of creating a safe zone along the border inside Syria, but a safe zone in which refugees could operate without pouring across the border into Turkey. Then, as we know, on the 24th of November, a Russian fighter bomber was shot down along the Hatay border just northwest of Idlib and was reportedly shot down by one of these Turkmen militias. Russian forces have retaliated with a furious bombardment in the whole area west of Aleppo, in the area around Idlib. Russians have used military aircraft, including helicopter gunships, and also ship-launched missiles to carry out this bombardment in retaliation for shooting down the Russian aircraft. Despite this offensive, the Turkmen militias have continued to gain territory at the expense of various Islamist militias in the area around Antioch. And just a couple of days ago, government forces once again resumed their offensive in the direction of Aleppo and managed to take back an area along the main north-south highway that had been overrun by Islamic State and by the Brigades of the Free in earlier times. I think what we see going on, part of what's the forest that grows out of all of these trees, is that we see that Islamic State has in fact been broadly contained, been broadly limited in its area of operations. I understand that President Obama was roundly criticized for making this point a couple of days before the attacks in Paris. But sure enough, Islamic State has reached the limit of its geographical control in Syria. Islamic State is being rolled back from the northeast by various Kurdish militias. It has been pushed out of the area around Idlib by a coalition of rival Islamist forces, and government forces have gradually been pushing north from Hama in the direction of Aleppo from the south. This has opened the door then for a number of local communities that were not politically active before, one of them being Turkey's Turkmen community, which most of us had paid very little attention to prior to 6 weeks ago, and the Turkmen militia also have carved out territory under their own control, and it's over some of this autonomous territory, not in Islamic State hands, but under the control of autonomous local militias, that the Russian Air Force has been carrying out most of its operations. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much for that scene setting. I'm now going to talk about the Russians. And really I want to cover 4 points. 1, why they went in. 2, who's there and what can they do. 3, to focus on the impact of this Turkish spat, put it in its mildest terms, which I think could potentially be, if not a game changer, certainly a game reshaper. And then finally consider some of the various potential outcomes. So let's start with why they went in. Well, of course, they went in to save Assad. Or did they? The answer is, in my opinion, not. There's a whole variety of reasons. But if I'm to say what the one crucial one is, it is nothing to do with Islamic State. It is nothing to do with Syria. It actually has everything to do with Russia's position in the world and Russians' relations with the West, which essentially means, given how they think of it, its relationship with Washington. Since the annexation of Crimea and then the subsequent roll into southeastern Ukraine, which has become something of a political as well as military quagmire, the Russians have been under increasing isolation pressures and also economic sanctions. Now, let's be honest, the reason why the Russian economy at the moment is suffering is primarily because of low oil prices. But certainly the sanctions don't help. And in some ways, part of an impact of the sanctions is going to mean it's going to be especially hard for the Russians to pull themselves out of the current economic crisis, because that will require a degree of economic diversification, which means investment, which basically means foreign capital. Although they have played the China card to an extent, China is not there to do any favors for the Russians. The Chinese are not soft-hearted humanitarians when it comes to business. They are not essentially Russia's allies at the moment. They are Russia's loan sharks. So basically, Russia is keenly aware that it is isolated, it is marginalized, it has been very much treated as an international pariah. And in fact, I mean, it's quite illustrative that before the Russian intervention, particularly the Americans were demonstrating far, far more eagerness to work with the Iranians in Iraq against Islamic State than to work with the Russians. Now, when the Americans are preferring the Iranians to you know you've really lost a lot of ground. And this is a definite problem. It was also a problem because of clearly of how Putin thinks of Russia's place in the world. He feels that Russia is a great power, and Russia has a voice that has to be listened to. And increasingly, he was feeling that it wasn't being listened to, rightly. Now, for a while, the Russians had been hoping that they could use the card of cooperation against terrorism as their way to sort of win back at least some lost ground. It's quite telling that they took one of their deputy heads of the Domestic Intelligence Service, Alexei Molotov, who had been in charge of security over Sochi, the Winter Olympics, and they actually made him into a brand new position of Deputy Foreign Minister for Counterterrorism Cooperation. You know, it's clearly marking this was a strategic push. But the problem was no one was biting. No one was really that interested. No one really thought the Russians had enough intelligence information that was worth sharing. And anyway, there was a great push against letting Russia, shall we say, back into the world community. Then the UN General Assembly came along, and Putin, for the first time in 10 years, decided he was going to go along and hobnob with other heads of state in New York. And Putin, by character, likes to catch people off guard. He likes to have a big, splashy initiative. And what could be bigger? What could be splashier than deploying forces and limited contingents in Syria? It's a high-risk strategy for reasons I'll come into. It's one of these ones where either it's going to be presented by the historians as an example of Putin's hubris or an example of Putin's brilliance. And it all depends on how the dice fall. But at the moment, it looks brilliant. With one move, one relatively minimal military move, he forced Russia back into the center of the conversation about Syria. He forced Russia back into the center of the conversation about how to deal with Islamic State generally. And in the process, he forced Russia back into the center of world affairs. So that, I would suggest, is the crucial point. This is seizing an opportunity to basically make one point. This is an area that is of interest to you, West. Well, it's also an area of interest to us, but more to the point, we can intrude into such a way that either we can be part of the solution if you want to work with us, or we can continue and make this part of a problem for you. This is the simple way in which it's being presented, albeit in rather more diplomatic terms. Now, in that context, why is it so important? Well, frankly, it's because Russia wants to pull out of the Donbass. Russia wants to at least reduce the international opprobrium in which it's being held, and in the process also at least reduce some of the sanctions. Crimea is not on the table, and therefore some sanctions will remain under any circumstances. But the point is they're hoping that the West will give them an out. This is not a case of basically telling the West, we'll be nice in Syria if you let us take Ukraine. I think they accept on one level that Ukraine is kind of lost. I mean, the Ukrainians will have demonstrate an extraordinary talent to mess up again. And probably in due course they will need to be dependent on Russia, and their oligarchs will still be dominant. But that's another matter. For here and now, Russia wants to basically have a peace with honor extraction from the Donbass. Put it in very crude terms, Vladimir Putin needs to have his mission accomplished moment, where he can claim that everything's gone fine and the Russians are pulling out of the Donbass because they've got the guarantees they need and the evil fascists of Kiev have been put in their place. So in other words, basically, this is not about Syria. But there are very specific reasons why it is also about Syria. But as I said, I would say on a secondary level. Do they want to preserve Assad? I don't think they do. But I think they realize that one of the most powerful cards at their disposal is they are the only people who can negotiate Assad out of office peacefully. And it's interesting, this is something that has been leaked in some press, but I've also had it from people I know in Moscow. Assad made an unexpected and unscheduled trip to Moscow. And on the surface, this was presented as a moment of brotherly amity. As I understand it, behind the scenes, he was told in no uncertain terms, you're going to have to go. But you're going to be going anyway. But this way, hopefully, going does not mean a war crimes tribunal in The Hague, or, basically being machine gunned and then hung by your foot in the middle of Damascus. We can offer you a negotiated way out, sanctuary, a nice dacha outside Moscow, where there is a growing colony of ex-dictators, after all. So, I'm sure they can have a social club or something. But in return for that, basically he will go in a way, in a time, or this is what they're hoping, of their choosing, that basically this is going to be something, a token that they can hold. For the West will have to buy that token. And at the same time, the Russians will still keep their allies in Syria. Because let's face it, it's not about one person, it's about a regime. Part of the negotiations which will see Assad go will also see some kind of government and national unity or whatever created that will mean that the rest of the regime, the Alawites, who not only are the Russians' main allies in the region, but also who depend on the Russians, for whom Putin is a savior, well, they will have some significant role within this regime. So they still get to have a role in Syria, and if you have a role in Syria, it means you have a role in the Middle East. And it means that you are back at the big boys' table, which is, again, really what Putin needs. Yes, striking ISIS, Islamic State, is also a plus. Very much this is how it's being sold to the Russian public in a current wall-to-wall media blitz on Russian television. The simple arithmetic is we will hit them in Syria so that we don't have to fight them in Russia. And it's not an entirely unreasonable position. More and more of the Jamaats, the local fighting cells of the insurgency within the North Caucasus, have been publicly declaring that they are switching their allegiance to Islamic State. Now, at the moment, that means nothing. It is just purely a symbolic gesture. There is no command or sort of structure in place. But the point is it could, and what the Russians are particularly worried about is returning fighters. People who've gone and they fought in Iraq and they fought in Syria and they come back. And they come back not just with experience and guns, but maybe they come back with friends, allies. But perhaps most importantly, they come back with a common cause. At the moment, one of the things that makes the North Caucasus insurgency for Russia bearable, manageable, is precisely it's a struggle against a whole variety of small groups. That machine gun a police patrol there, that carry out a bombing here, all terrible in its own way, but frankly it's become normalized and largely it stays within the North Caucasus. It's a shame, but what can you do? It's no big deal. The Kremlin knows it can basically withstand that. But if the fighters come back with a common sense of identity, which means that this group from Kabardino-Balkaria actually meaningfully unites and combines with that group from Dagestan and this group from Ingushetia and so forth, suddenly it could turn what is currently a low-level inconvenience into a region-wide coordinated insurgency. And that is a serious concern. That is one of the things that basically keeps Russian security planners up at night. So actually, yeah, hammer them by all means. I remember this summer, I was talking to someone. It's a very Russian thing. I mean, technically he's an academic, but in practice, I'm sure he's got a field rank within the security apparatus somewhere. Anyway, and he was being most aggrieved. He said the big problem with Syria and the big problem with Islamic State is that, I mean, you might be able to tell from the accent, but I don't actually hail from these shores. So it's a subtle thing. But anyway, he decided that for the purposes of this conversation, I was American. And he was saying the big problem about Islamic State is that you Americans haven't killed enough of them. And he was definitely aggrieved. He was saying, for God's sake, the one thing we relied on you. I mean, I think the Russians had an exaggerated notion of the power of drones and so forth to winnow Islamic State's ranks. It's nice to know that they can be as wrong as people on this side. But so, yes, it's about fighting Islamic State. And the final point I'd throw in, it's also about controlling Iran. So on the one level, they are the Iranians' allies. Iran and Russia are the people supporting Assad. But the point is, Iran could at best be considered a frenemy. It is an ally in the sense of dislikes many of the same people, but on the other hand, it's also, regionally speaking, a rival for influence. I mean, I remember once I was in Baku. It was fascinating. The Russians in Azerbaijan trying to push their own soft power, but it's a whole carnival of people doing the same. Israelis, Turks, and very heavily Iranians as well. So in that situation, the thing is, Iran's power, Iran's influence within Syria is actually not through its position so much within the government forces as within the parallel army of militias that it, with its proxies, Hezbollah, has created. Now, the thing is, if Damascus, and I use Damascus as being the regime, if that fragments, then the Russians lose their traction in Syria. But that wouldn't necessarily mean that the Iranian militia movement would fragment too. So interestingly, to the West, they're coming and saying, you need to work with us because we can help you fight ISIS, Islamic State. within the Gulf states and so forth, they're saying, we're the people who can actually stop Iran from basically taking over in Syria. So a whole variety of reasons why. But the key thing is they are not looking and they're not able to make this into a big war. Frankly, this current deployment actually has surprised everyone with how well it's gone. But this is pretty much, I mean, they could probably surge a few thousand more people in at most. At the moment, you have about 4,000 Russians there. Most of those are support and security people. And a fair number of them are contractors busy dredging the installation at Tartus on the coast. It's often described as a naval base. If a naval base can be described as basically a pier and a shack, which is pretty much what Tartus had become. So they're building that up to be something a little bit more substantial. But essentially, what the Russians have are groups of air power. They have about 3 dozen jets and ground attack aircraft and helicopters. And they have some artillery, particularly heavy howitzers, long-range weapons, mainly based around Latakia. This is just simply to provide air power and support. Ultimately, wars like this are going to be won by ordinary grunts on the ground. Whether they are Syrian soldiers, whether they're militias, whether they're allies or whoever. Air power can only just provide support. And already, frankly, the Syrian offensive, which has had some success, but pretty quite limited. Janes sort of worked out that they reckon that the impact of the latest offensive brought back under government control 0.4% of the territory of the country. Now, okay, much of the territory is just desert and doesn't really matter. You know, strategic territory and settlements are what really matters, but still, it's pretty limited. Really, what the Russians have done is put in a force that is visible, it's political, and that's one of the reasons why they've also been using long-range strategic bombers and cruise missiles from ships on the Caspian, all these kind of sort of good techno-war type stuff, because it makes a good political gesture. But when it comes down to it, the current deployment, all it can do, in my opinion, is slow down any ultimate defeat of the Damascus regime. It cannot turn the tide of war on the battlefield. To have a significant impact, they'd have to put 2, 3, 4 brigades minimum in. Now, to take that out of war wonk, that's talking about up to 20,000 troops. They can't get 20,000 troops there. They can't, above all, supply 20,000 troops. And frankly, they haven't got 20,000 spare troops anyway. Not of the sort that are actually of the capability to be able to deploy it. So, this is essentially a political move more than anything else. And this is why the Turkey issue is so significant. Now, I mean, the Putin-Erdogan relationship is an interesting and complex one, not least because in so many ways they're quite similar. The interesting thing is, I mean, the Turks clearly were, in my opinion, basically waiting. I mean, the Russians have described it as an ambush, and in some respect they're right. This Russian bomber was over Turkish airspace for 17 seconds. By the Turkish own account. I mean, the Russians say, no, it wasn't over Turkish airspace. But let's give the Turks the benefit of the doubt. 17 seconds. And Erdogan says that he himself gave the order to fire from the Turkish F-16 jets that shot it down. Well, first of all, there's not many warnings you can throw into 17 seconds before you launch your missile. Secondly, look, jets cross over into other people's borders all the time. All the time. I mean, if you look at the number of times Turkish jets have gone into Greek airspace, for want of a better word, etiquette is that if that happens, you intercept it, fire a warning shot maybe, force it down or get it out of your airspace. But the point is, this was already heading out. You don't shoot something down unless it actually represents a direct threat. Or unless you really want to make a point. And this is clearly what was happening. The Turks are wanting to make a point. They wanted to make the point that we are players around here. Erdogan is busy trying to kind of recreate a certain sort of regional power status for Turkey. And he wants the Russians to acknowledge that. And he wants the Russians to recognize the borders more seriously. He also wants to stop the Russians from pounding the Turkmen, who are, after all, Turkish proxies, and particularly proxies of MIT, which is not actually the university, but Turkish military intelligence, and a particularly unpleasant bunch of people they are. Interestingly, one of the Turkmen leaders is reportedly actually a key figure within the Grey Wolves neo-fascist terrorist movement, that basically has been on and off run by MIT. They're the guys who shot Pope John Paul II and that kind of thing. So basically, Turkish proxies were at risk, and they wanted to protect Turkish proxies. And quite possibly, it was also an attempt to basically muddy things up so that the Russians couldn't get too involved in some kind of coalition peace and war, shall I say, coalition within Syria. So, where do I think this is going to go? And obviously, I mean, there's lots of things that can be left open for questions. Broadly speaking, what the Russians want is what the moment they're getting. They're being considered serious players. You have Hollande of France going there and basically being very keen to establish some kind of relationship with the Russians, saying, fair enough, we won't bomb rebel groups that are also fighting, that are busy fighting ISIS. So that's successful. They might get some kind of movement over Ukraine. On that, wait and see. Washington is very resistant. Europe is much keener. We can go into that in questions if you want in more detail later. But, wars are always unpredictable beasts. This kind of messy, muddy, multi-sided, multi-vectored civil war, all the more so. So far, we've been amazed by how well things have gone for the Russians. Yes, they've lost a plane, they've lost a couple of people and so forth, but this is a war. But what happens when, and I think it is probably when, there's some major, possibly terrorist-style incident? You think of how America was basically politically forced to withdraw from Lebanon in, keep getting it, 82 or 83, when there was a truck bombing of the Marine barracks. Well, what happens, let's say, if one of these big transport ships that comes into Latakia, loaded up with ammunition, has a couple of speedboats packed with explosives ram into it, and the whole thing blows up pyrotechnically, immediately to be uploaded onto YouTube? Will the Russians be willing to hold to their current plan? Will they be tempted to escalate, which way lies madness, or will they be forced to withdraw, which way lies political embarrassment? So far, the Russians have been lucky. So far, they've been rolling the dice, and the numbers have been fine. But you keep rolling the dice, and sometimes the numbers don't. So I'll stop.
So I should just perhaps start off by, I'm sure Mark just omitted this, but there was one dramatic terrorist incident of which the Russians were the primary victims, which was the shooting down of that commercial airliner over Egypt. So there's already been a major blowback element. My assignment today was to talk about U.S. options in responding to the Russian intervention. So unlike most academics, that's what I will actually talk about. Last year in the spring, I gave a talk here that was entitled "Why I Think the Ukraine Crisis is Still Very Dangerous, despite the Minsk Agreement that had been signed in February." I called that my Chicken Little talk. The sky is falling. In brief, my argument was that the Ukraine crisis was at root the product of an intensifying geopolitical struggle between Russia and the West in general, and between Russia and the United States in particular. That the most dangerous dimension of that struggle was the military dimension, and that there was a genuine risk of a military conflict with Russia, that this conflict is likely to last, or this struggle is likely to last, hopefully below a military conflict threshold, but not necessarily. And that one of the reasons why it's likely to last is because there's a powerful ideological element to that struggle. So what I'm going to do, so my talk today is basically, Chicken Little double down. And I'm going to make three main points. One is that I think Russia's intervention has significantly increased the risks of a military clash between Russia and on the one hand and the U.S. and NATO on the other hand. I think the likelihood of a genuine grand coalition with Russia, which is what Russia has been pushing for, against ISIS or against terrorists in Syria in general, however defined, is very low. and that the U.S. has some extremely difficult choices to make in trying to respond to what Russia has done, and that we are definitely in this zone of all options are bad, and so the mission is to try to find the least worst option going forward. So the first point, the increased risk of a direct military clash. You know, it seems clear to me that what happened with the shooting down of the Sukhoi 24 by Turkey last week just should, you know, highlight the extent to which there is a risk of this, and the risk of this, you know, escalating, where it becomes difficult for the two sides to back down. And remember that Turkey is a NATO ally, for better or worse. Russia and the U.S. have open military operations underway in the same conflict zone, an extremely complex and dynamic one. That's really the first time that has happened since the end of World War II. There were substantial Soviet pilots and planes involved in the Korean War, but they were not open. They weren't marked as Soviets, essentially a covert operation. In this, you know, Fred has already explained how incredibly complex the sort of ground situation is in terms of this conflict, but it's also extraordinarily complex in terms of the number of external actors and their different kinds of interest in this conflict zone. And I'll just show you this. You know, it's a crowded one, lots of actors, enormous complexity. Now you have these two big powers that have combat operations underway, primarily airstrikes, but not only. And what this map shows is where these airstrikes have been taking place at different periods since the Russians started getting involved. And you can see that you know, most of it has been concentrated in the sort of Aleppo, northeast Latakia area, but it's in other areas as well. Finally found this. In Raqqa, in Deir al-Zur, in Damascus, and so forth. So, you know, this is an area where our planes are both operating regularly and carrying out bombing, you know, airstrikes. And there's a obvious need and concern about what they call deconfliction. That is to say, making sure that you don't do anything by mistake that entails shooting down another plane. Just on the complexity of the situation on the ground, Fred already gave you, I thought, a very nice summary of just how complex that is, how many different groups there are, how difficult it is to actually target, you know, appropriately. There's a very interesting report recently from the Institute for the Study of War that lists all the different, or at least as many of the sort of key combat groups that they can identify in the Syrian conflict, and they identify, I think it's 53 just in the Aleppo front alone. So you're talking about, you know, a dense and very complicated conflict area. There are also some very important long-term implications about the Russian military, intervention. So up until Russia's move in September, the U.S. military has been very worried for a long time about what they call area access, area denial problems with China in the East China, in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, and other areas to some extent as well. And particularly after Ukraine, they've been very worried about similar kinds of problems with Russia in the Black Sea, in the Arctic, and particularly in the Eastern Mediterranean area. And what that basically means is what they're worried about is that in the event of a conflict, their forces actually wouldn't be able to operate there. Or they would only be able to operate in those areas after a lot of effort, and they can't be confident that they would actually prevail there. Now they're starting, they already some time ago, the commander of European forces in Europe said that they're increasingly worried about a area access, area denial problem in the Eastern Mediterranean as well. And that was before the deployment, my battery seems to be dying here. Just this past week, extremely rapidly after the shooting down of this Sukhoi 24 jet by Turkey, of the most, I think what most military people would tell you is the most sophisticated air defense system in the world, which is this new S-400 air defense system that Russia has, which they've deployed to a base in Latakia province, or governorate. And what this shows is, so there are different kinds of missiles that can be associated with that air defense system, but this shows the one that would be the missile with the greatest, they call missile engagement zone. And you can see just how huge that is. It includes Incirlik Air Base. It includes most of Israel, of northern Israel, including Tel Aviv, and right on, apparently right on the edge. I'm sure this is, a little vague, but right on the edge of Jerusalem. So it's a huge area, and what that means is that for military operations by Western forces, by the United States or its allies, including Israel, in this area, they are essentially, they're at the discretion of the Russians, as they say about serving at the discretion of the president. To a certain extent, they'll be operating at the discretion of the Russians in that area. And that, is going to have very long, if that system stays in place, I think that's going to have, major implications. And it's just hard for me to believe, for example, that the Israelis in particular are going to find that acceptable. The Israelis have been regularly conducting bombing exercises, airstrikes, not exercises, airstrikes against Hezbollah targets, or supposedly against Hezbollah targets. Particularly along this border here, and they will be flying in this area that is now where they have a chance of being lit up by Russian radar, and conceivably you can at least imagine an accident taking place very easily. All right, so that gets me to my second point. Actually, hold on this. Which is why it is that I don't think a grand coalition with Russia is very, very likely. So just an initial point, it's very hard to see how the United States and Russia would ever actually kind of agree on military operations, say targeting. I can kind of imagine how they might say, okay, you get this area and we get this area, but an actual kind of collaborative effort against ISIS or other terrorist groups is hard to imagine, because certainly the Russians are not going to want to subordinate themselves to the American military, and the American military is absolutely not going to do the same thing with Russia. So that was a big problem at an earlier time with the NATO bombing campaign in Serbia, and the Russians absolutely did not want to serve under any kind of NATO general. And that would be a similar issue if we're any kind of coordinated military effort in this conflict zone. Second, Russia on the one hand, and the U.S. and most of its coalition allies on the other hand, have very different objectives in Syria. And that's where I'll go with this slide. So this is, a neat kind of complicated slide. Obviously, you're not going to want to read the whole thing. Basically, looks at the major actors, what their objectives are in Syria. I mean, you got a lot of players in the first place. What their objectives are and how they differ. And if you look closely at it, you'll see that a lot of the U.S. interests are different from the interests of its coalition allies, but certainly different from, obviously, the interests of ISIS, but also of Russia. And what they've done here is highlight in red, the one that they think is the most important issue, which is removing Assad. Now, I agree with Mark. So they have Russia here, wherever it is. Where's Russia? Russia, bolster Assad. I very much agree with Mark that I don't really think Assad is particularly important to the Russians. By all accounts, Putin doesn't like Assad, and probably vice versa. They'd be perfectly happy to see them go. But that is not necessarily true for Iran. And of course, it's not necessarily true for Assad himself. So even if it were the case that Putin said, okay, time for you to leave, I don't know that Assad actually would leave under those circumstances. But the other more serious problem is that it's not just an issue of Assad. It's an issue of the regime. The regime is perceived as an Alawite regime, or controlled in large measure, I assume, as far as I know, it actually is more or less controlled by it. It doesn't mean everybody are working for the state or in the security apparatus is Alawite, but the perception at the very least is that it's an Alawite regime with basically a clan Assad kind of control. So even if you remove Assad, you still have this very fundamental problem of the regime wanting to move this Shia Alawi regime wanting to move with Russian assistance into areas, into Sunni areas where there are lots of rebel forces of all different kinds of types, including Islamists, but not only. So that is also an extremely difficult thing to kind of sort out, and where you're for sure going to get major differences between the different actors and their objectives, including within this broad U.S.-led coalition. So more, another point is, within this, coalition, the U.S. can't really control a lot of its allies. So let's say the Pentagon said, look, we really want to work with the Russians, and we just want to agree with the Russians. We're now going to target ISIS, and we're maybe going to leave some of the more moderate groups or whatever alone. Imagine that you'd actually able to identify those, which would be extremely difficult. But let's say you could do that. Turkey, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, are they likely to go along with that? I'd rather doubt it. And moreover, it's not clear that the United States can control the extent to which those allies are supplying the anti-Assad opposition with very important weapons, particularly these TOW anti-tank guided missile weapons, which are having a big impact on the battlefield. So most of those forces are attacking Assad and his forces, and the forces that are being assisted by the Russian Federation. So that's just some of the reasons. I'm going to skip over a few others about why I don't think a grand coalition is very likely. I can imagine, I should say, some kind, coordination. There's already been what they call deconfliction with Russia, which I think is absolutely essential, because we do not want the Russians to shoot down an American plane, or Americans to shoot down a Russian plane, or the Israelis to shoot down, a Russian plane. God only knows where that would go. But so what are the U.S. actual options? So there are basically three, in principle, right? One, you can cooperate with Russia militarily against ISIS or the other so-called terrorist groups, assuming you could ever agree on what those groups were. You could try to make the Russian intervention militarily more costly. That is actually the heart of the very tough decision that the U.S. has to make, and where I think different administrations would come to different kinds of conclusions. I'll talk about that more in a moment. Or you could proceed as before with what has been called the sort of slow strangulation, air campaign against ISIS, and then with deconfliction efforts with Russia. So let me just talk briefly about. Oops, don't want to do that. About each one of these options. So with respect to military cooperation with Russia, I've already said why I think some kind of grand coalition is pretty unlikely, hard to imagine how that would actually work out. But there's two other very important factors I should just mention here. One is that, is it really politically possible for the Obama administration, which is definitely more dovish than is, any administration that's likely to follow, is it possible for it politically, domestically, to cooperate with Russia in a military campaign to help an Alawite regime restore territorial control in Syria? I mean, there are many reasons why I'm going to say no to that, but one is this regime has been extremely brutal. It has by all accounts, responsible for the vast majority of the civilian and other casualties in the war. And as I said before, it's also one that is perceived as an Alawite regime. And are we going to want to be, once again in a situation where we look to be supporting a sectarian regime that is targeting Sunnis? I'm pretty sure the answer to that is no. And then the other problem, which I guess I already mentioned, was the extent to which it's not just about Assad, but it's about the regime itself. So the second option, make Russia's intervention more costly. And of course, the way you would do that is by increasing military support for the various rebel groups that are fighting primarily Assad rather than ISIS. Now, to an extent that's already happened. There's already been a pretty substantial surge in the lethal weapons that the rebels have been getting in some complicated way from the United States and from Saudi Arabia and from other external actors, these TOW anti-tank missiles. There's been a big surge of them appearing on the battlefield. And a big surge in them, destroying Assad's equipment. So you could increase that. And then there's another, you could, supply arms in other kinds of ways, but there are also people who say the opposition should be supplied with so-called man pads, shoulder-fired, what used to be called stingers, shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles for bringing down helicopters and low-flying ground attack aircraft, fixed-wing aircraft. So obviously there's tons of problems with that too, right? So it's very, very difficult for them to control their end use or who the end user is. So these weapons get in, it's a completely chaotic battle zone. They end up in the hands of the wrong people, and they're targeting people that you don't want them to target. Then, of course, there's a possibility that they're going to fall into the hands of terrorists who are going to target Western or civilian targets like commercial aircraft. That is particularly a risk with man pads, but it's also a risk with TOWs. They can hit planes that are commercial airlines that are on the ground or that are just taking off. There's a reason why you don't want to just flood Syria with these effective weapons, or there are many reasons why, in fact. And then a final factor is that doing so probably is going to prolong the war. I mean, the war is going to last a long time anyway. I don't see there's any prospect for this war ending quickly. Short of some huge external ground invasion, which is not going to happen. The only country that could do that is the United States. The United States is not going to do that. I think that's true even if we have Donald Trump as president. I mean, I just don't see the American public is prepared for another really huge and costly and endless military ground operation in the Middle East. So let me then get to the third option, which is carry on as before with this sort of slow anti-ISIS strangulation campaign, along with deconfliction and possibly even some measure of coordination with Russia. I think that is the most likely thing that's going to happen, as both Fred and I think Mark alluded to. ISIS has already been contained, has been losing territory in some areas, and also, looks like it's being hammered enough that they're starting to, make alternative plans for where we go when we lose Raqqa. So the problem with that is this core issue of, okay, let's say we drive ISIS to Libya, or they leave. Let's say they're levitated out. What happens then? What forces occupy those territories? Are Kurds going to enter, Arab majority, Sunni Raqqa, and somehow govern it? No. Is the United States going to be okay with this, Alawite, more or less regime retaking substantial amounts of territory? That's not going to be a good outcome either. So that's on the one hand. But why do I think that is probably the least worst option and the one that I think Obama is going to take? First off, it's obviously less costly than pretty much all the other alternatives. And it does have one strategic advantage on balance. I mean, I have to say I have no idea really what's going to eventually happen. But it does have one strategic advantage, which is already very clear, which is that Russia is starting to get more and more of the blame for what's going on. Its military, its airstrikes have been much less careful. They've already killed a lot of civilians. Just yesterday, they killed 40-plus civilians in a market that's gotten a whole lot of public attention. And it cannot be that this is helping Russia with its, perception in the Sunni world, and the vast majority of Russian Muslims, or Muslims who are Russian citizens in Russia itself, are Sunnis. So at any rate, this does help distribute the blame for what's going on slightly to the benefit of the United States and its allies, if you're going to be purely cynical about the whole thing, which God forbid I would never be. And then it also will basically mean that the United States will kind of defer this key choice to sort of what happens, or maybe to the Russians, of who occupies this territory. It'll just sort of happen, and it won't be our fault. And so regime forces go here, Kurdish forces go there, whoever go there and there. We're not trying to not just nation build, but we're not trying to produce a particular outcome. We're just trying to degrade ISIS and hopefully drive it out of Syria. So to conclude, what I think is going to happen. So this is not what I necessarily want to have happen. It's just what I'm trying to forecast a little bit here. As I said, I think the Obama administration is most likely to go with some version of the third option. There's not going to be a big change in its strategy in Syria. I don't think there's going to be a political solution in Syria, particularly one that's imposed from the outside, unfortunately, until there's some kind of internal military balance that enables it, and I just don't see that happening for a long time. So unfortunately, I think this war is going to continue until there's some kind of military outcome that makes a political solution conceivable, and I don't see that happening anytime soon. Eventually, though, the most likely outcome, I think, is some kind of de facto rump Alawite state. It doesn't have to have Assad there, but there'll be some rump state. It will be a Russian client. Russia is going to be then faced with the political, economic, and military costs of defending that rump state and keeping it there. And that's going to be costly and, I suspect, endless. And Russia's military presence is going to have, I think, a long-term and dangerous impact on the military balance in the region. And I just remind you, this air defense system, this, area access, area denial issue in here, how are the Turks and the Israelis going to accept that over a long period of time? The Israelis in particular are not, they've been very quiet about all this. They're clearly kind of cooperating to some extent with Russia. Netanyahu went to Moscow and apparently gave it the green light for this. But I cannot believe that the Israelis actually think it's okay for some external power to come in and have this, very, very powerful air defense system in this area that they operate in regularly. And at the same time, Russia has just announced that it is going to proceed with its sales of this almost as sophisticated S-300 system to Iran. And I cannot believe the Israelis think that's okay either, and the Israelis have a lot of guns. So I will leave you with that happy thought.
Do you want to go back to the map?
there?
Okay, great.
Maybe that one.
Okay. All right. So now we're going to open up the floor for questions. So if you have questions, if you'd please move to the center microphone and ask.
Could I ask if we could have the next map, the anti-aircraft map?
Yeah.
Sorry, you and I are playing both of them. No?
Okay, I was just going to say that in the First World War, Turkey went with the German side, of course, and then we got Sykes-Picot. We've all heard about Sykes-Picot. Syria went to France, Iraq went to Britain. Later on, Britain installed a Hashemite monarch in Iraq after about 1931 or something like that. So the southern, southeastern border is controlled by Britain and France. Then you had the area around Constantinople was controlled by the Allies, I think as a measure to keep the Russians from taking the Straits. So they had the Sultan set up there in a puppet regime. The Greeks marched into Western Asia Minor. I don't know exactly what they wanted to conquer, but they wanted to conquer some parts of Western Asia Minor. The French and the Italians were in Antalya and Adana. So basically, Turkey was almost completely obliterated after the first peace treaty, after the First World War. And then Ataturk came. So Ataturk is the Grey Wolves, or whatever you want to call them. He restores Turkish suzerainty in most of Asia Minor. And this is the situation that remains until about 1939. Now, in 1939, that little light green corner there to Syria, which originally was part of the Sykes-Picot thing, which belonged to Syria, was taken by the French and given back to the Turks. And I'm not sure the exact reason for this, but apparently it's a Turkish region. Plebiscite, okay. So basically, I think it was also a kind of a peace offering to the Turks to try and keep them out of the Second World War, but I don't know about that. So anyway, what I think now the situation is that the Turkish regime, Erdogan, is kind of like Putin in a sense. He wants to restore Turkish suzerainty, Turkish, what do you want to call it, prominence or whatever. And it seems to me like the eastern border of Syria has already been obliterated, more or less. It seems to me like the Turks are now basically considering sort of an expansion of that 1939 adjustment there with the plebiscite you were talking about. There are other Turkish minorities in northern Syria. There's actually been Turkish cross-border attacks into northern Syria because there's a Kurdish state in northern Syria there. It seems to me like the Turks are going to try and sort of rectify this northern border of Syria to their liking. They're going to include maybe Turkish minorities and Turkish militias and whatever you want to call them, and try and suppress Kurdish ones. It seems to me like the basic reason for this is the Kurdish problem, which Turkey has been fighting for the last 25 or 30 years. It seems to me like the next 5 or 10 years is basically going to be a question of how much Turkey is going to succeed in obliterating that northern Syria border and actually decreasing Kurdish influence and increasing Turkish influence, and Assad be damned. That's what I think. Anyway.
Is there a question?
Well, it's probably worth saying a couple of words about the Kurds up there in the northeast. So up in the northeast, there is this Kurdish organization, the Popular Democratic Union, and from Turkey's point of view, the Kurdish organization in Syria is nothing but the old Marxist-Leninist PKK under a new name. So Turkey has no use for that political organization. Turkey completely mistrusts whatever the PYD might be doing, whatever autonomous administration the PYD might be setting up. And we have a Turkish specialist in the room, so I bite my tongue before I say this, but my guess is that the Turks are pushing hard for this safe zone along the border, partly to make sure that what the Turks think of as PKK do not control the whole of northern Syria all the way along the border, that might leave an opening for the real PKK to end its ceasefire and begin attacking Turkey again. So the Kurds are really an important player in this whole situation. And as near as I can tell, Russia has been making overtures to the Kurds in Syria, but has sort of let the Kurds line up with Washington instead of pushing hard. Has Moscow been pushing hard for an alliance with the Kurds in Syria?
If anything, interesting enough, it's actually been the Kurds who've been making overtures to the Russians, because after all, having the Russians as your friend in Syria also means you have air power on your side. I mean, I don't think it's a sentimental, but a practical issue. Given that, I mean, Kurdistan in Iraq is de facto an autonomous state already. I can't help but wonder if the Turks do want to extend their authority into Kurdish parts of Syria. On the one hand, yes, it gives them the chance to then sort of crack the whip. But on the other hand, it's also giving a huge number of new problems to Ankara. And let's say there's another country that has a habit of being mischievous to those who displease it, and you just shot down one of their bombers. In some ways, the opportunity to stir up even more trouble within Turkish borders is something that you can almost imagine Moscow quite liking. I mean, I think this is, again, the underlying leitmotif of this area, which, as you know, if you don't mind me getting into sort of technical political science terms, it's a mess. I mean, there are just so many different cross-cutting and often overlapping ethnic, political, religious identities. And in part, it's because of, yes, I mean, past historical imperial decisions, as well as a whole variety of other issues. The interesting thing is that I think Turkey will discover, just like everyone else who tries to get involved in this area, that there are ultimately no good options. Turkey is enjoying the fact that it is now a pivotal player within NATO. I mean, even perversely, the fact that there's 1.7 million refugees in Turkey actually gives it a weapon against the Europeans, because the Europeans are desperate that the Turks keep them there. But in the long term, these are actually all going to be challenges for Turkey as well.
I would just make two quick additional points, which is that the PKK is a semi-peculiar Marxist ideology, and had long-standing relations with the Soviet Union, and I'm sure still has relations with, well, Mark would know much better with Russian security organs. The other thing is just to highlight some of what we suggested. I had another slide here. This one. So this is from a Russian source called, or Russian-based source. I have no idea what its actual provenance is or whatever, but it does have pretty interesting sort of combat updates and videos actually of of the Syrian battle zone almost daily. This is from the day, either the day before or 2 days before the Russian Su-24 was shot down. And so what it shows is up in that corner up there, what in the text you see down there was described as a major surprise offensive against, in this area, against basically Turkoman villages right up to the Russian border. Now, Turkey had been warning Russia repeatedly, basically not to stray into its airspace, which I think Putin should have understood is, I don't really care that much about straying for 17 seconds into our airspace, but we care about you bombing right along our borders, our ethnic kin. And the sort of related point is one would think that the Russians would be a little bit sensitive to that because they have this compatriots policy along their borders. And, do not mess with Russian speakers in, for example, the Donbass. And one could imagine how the Russians would react if American planes were bombing, Russian-speaking towns right on their border. But, at any rate, again, it's just conveys the both the incredible complexity of all this, but also just how risky it is.
Could I follow up real quick, Ned? Because as you were speaking, something struck me. When the Russians then moved that sophisticated anti-aircraft system into Syria, I just thought it was an immediate overreaction to shooting down the plane. But as you were speaking, I wondered, it must have taken some preparation. It must have taken some planning to get that system on the plane or on the boats and there. Do you suppose that shooting down the plane, straying into Turkish airspace was a pretext? Was Russia preparing to deploy those anti-aircraft missiles anyway?
Well, Mark should answer that question.
No. It's simple. I mean, first of all, soldiers create contingency plans for every situation. I mean, there's no doubt a contingency plan for what happens if flying saucers land on the White House lawn. Actually loading an S-500 onto, they have these great huge cargo planes, the AN-124. It's what it's designed to do. One of the things that we know is the Russians have later been training hard, and training hard means you can also get to do things well. So the thing is, when it comes down to it, Moscow doesn't need excuses. If Moscow had wanted to send the S-400, they'd have sent the S-400. If anything, up to that point, the Syrians had been clamoring for more air cover. And the Russians, aware that precisely there are risks associated with it, as Ned pointed out, had been a little bit resistant. I think this, but yes, I mean, on the other hand, this was entirely an emotional, you're going to do this to us? Well, this is what we're going to do back.
Yeah, Ned, I just wanted to say I agree with you entirely. The reason the plane was shot down was not a violation of airspace, but bombing the Turkmen. After the incident, the Turkish General Staff made some vague comment about, oh, we've had 117 violations of our airspace in recent months, not necessarily referring just to airspace along the Turkish-Syrian border, as if to say that wasn't what counted. They also, of course, said this is a political decision. Erdogan made it, not us. But on the 19th of November, the Turkish Foreign Ministry invited the Russian ambassador in for a little talk, and they warned the Russian ambassador that the Russians were going too far. They said nothing, as far as I can tell, in this press report about violations of airspace. But they did say the area where Russian operations were being conducted was free of the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant or other terrorist groups. There are Turkmen living in this area. Civilian Turkmen were being harmed by Russia's operations. It should be noted, Turkey won't be indifferent to attacks targeting the life security of Turkmen. So the Russians, in a way, were warned. And nevertheless, it was a political decision, but Turkmen are a hot-button issue in Turkey. And this was something that just couldn't go on forever. So were the Turks reckless? Were the Russians reckless? I don't know. You tell me. Well, who bombed the Turkmen? You know, which lives do you value more highly?
So in a recent article I read about a week ago, John Mearsheimer at Harvard, leading person of the realist school, said the U.S. interest is a secure and stable Syria. And he said the only way to get there is to support Assad with Russia and Iran, together with them, and that's the way to deal with the problem, to make it secure again. So do you agree with this idea that how to deal with the situation and whether that is our major interest in the area?
Let's put it this way. When this conflict started getting violent, I was pretty sure it was going to get a lot more violent. And there was a part of me that said, you know, actually, I just wish the Assad regime would succeed in its very quickly and as painlessly as possible in suppressing all this, because it's just going to get so. And it's, in my view, it's part of this great unraveling of Shia and Sunni, essentially, of the Middle East and the unraveling of these borders. But I think we're way past that now, for the reasons I elaborated. I just think, cooperating with it's certainly not going to solve the problem, and cooperating with having a, minority government take over with Russian assistance, Sunni areas after all this bloodletting is not going to solve the problem. I think he's naive, naive realism. There's a lot of that going around.
So I guess first of all, I want to thank each of you. It's been very informative and provocative presentation. Unfortunately, it's hard to get this quality of information without really seeking it out. One thing that strikes me is I guess this is more directed at Mark, but also the others. Are we basically seeing a kind of, we had a new world order after the Soviet Union fell, and where the U.S. was the sole superpower and dominant superpower, and the folks that were looking to, well, where is the next challenge going to come from? And I'm thinking of the neocons, the people, what was it, Project for the New American Century and Wolfowitz and all those folks that were running Bush's foreign policy they were worried about China. It was the Middle East, the Middle East, and we're concerned about the oil in the Middle East and geopolitical significance of that. But we see China as the next great threat, and even Obama's been talking about the pivot to China and wanting to cool down the Middle East so we can get to dealing with China, which it seems like that's already bubbling up anyway. For some reason, Russia was counted out as any kind of global power, and was that, I don't know, in hindsight, you still have this hugely powerful military. No one has this, after the U.S. has anything roughly equivalent in terms of military capability. So I'm just wondering, does this, and some of my takeaway from all your presentations was, it's really not about terrorism, it's about geopolitics, and on both sides. I mean, one thing that's baffled me is, that slide was really interesting in terms of what are the interests and goals of the different parties, but we want to get rid of ISIS, but we also want to get rid of Assad. That doesn't compute to me. I mean, maybe as a long term, but, in that sense, frankly, Putin, what he said in the UN, even if it was totally disingenuous, was more coherent in terms of saying, well, the main forces that can challenge ISIS on the ground in Syria is the Syrian regime, So it's kind of like you got to decide what your, main objective is. Is it getting rid of Assad or is it getting rid of ISIS? And it seems clear that on either part, it's not actually getting rid of ISIS. It's more about the geopolitical aspect. The other thing is striking to me is that we had a coalition with Russia during World War II, right? There wasn't any question about who the main enemy was at that point, I guess, from either the U.S. or Russian perspective. We worked with Russia to scale back when we were about to strike Syria around the chemical weapons, and there was an agreement they're going to get rid of the chemical weapons. We worked with Russia around the Iran nuclear settlement. So it seems to me if the political will were there on either side, why wouldn't some kind of negotiated settlement be possible? I mean, after all, where are all the weapons going into Syria coming from? They're all coming from the outside. I don't think anyone's manufacturing weapons in Syria. I mean, it's the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the U.S., Russia. That's where they're all coming from. And I agree that Turkey and Saudi Arabia have their own.
It's your point, sir. You've been going on for.
Okay. I'm sorry.
I'd like to hear these
I'll-
questions.
Yeah. Well, the question about the geopolitical axis changing, and also the question about is the agenda about getting rid of is it about terrorism or geopolitics?
Yeah,
so let me leave it at that.
Surely Syria is a place where those two considerations overlap. I mean, surely Syria is the place where Russia can find an opening to exert a little bit of influence, to get a little bit of prestige. Russia was pushing around the borders. Russia made an effort to build bridges to Egypt after the Muslim Brother president was thrown out. Emissaries from Moscow tried to sell some weaponry, tried to give some economic assistance to Egypt, so been pushing in the direction of Egypt. As Mark said, Russia's been pushing in the direction of the Islamic Republic of Iran. If I remember correctly, Putin was in Tehran the day the Russian jet was shot down. So I was trying to figure out where he made these statements from. Did he make the statements from Iran or on the plane back to Moscow or whatever? So Russia's pushing into a number of countries in the Middle East right at the moment. So that's the geopolitical part. I still think it's important that these various armed militants have come out of the North Caucasus, have ended up getting battlefield experience, getting some organizational skills inside Syria. And as Mark said, if Russia can fight those militants in Syria instead of fighting them in Dagestan, that's probably in Russia's interest as well. So there's a kind of convergence between the two, I think, and the place where they converge seems to be Syria.
You know, let me also touch on this issue of Russia's strength and so forth. My view is often that actually Putin plays a weak hand very, very well, and the West, because we are afflicted with things like democracy and such like, we play a very strong hand quite badly. Because if you think about it, the Russian economy, even putting aside its current travails, in underlying terms, it's somewhere between that of Italy and Brazil. And no one's really worrying these days about the Italian war machine. Obviously, the Russians put more of their resources into the military, but even so, I mean, NATO outspends the Russians in military terms by more than 10 times. NATO can outman, outgun, outfight Russia without any trouble. Yes, Russia has a thermonuclear arsenal. That's fine if you want to blow up the world. That's about all you can do with it. So, I mean, the interesting thing about Russia is that this is, I mean, to slightly trivialize it, I mean, actually, this has been the triumph of chutzpah as much as anything else. The same sort of level of commitment, I mean, the British or the French could have put 36 planes into Syria if they wanted, and if the Syrian regime had been willing to give them an airbase and a port to do it. The thing about the Russians is not so much that they're strong, but that A, they're not as weak as precisely it was assumed in the 1990s. I mean, I think that was one of the key Western and above all American errors, is to completely write off the Russians rather than sort of seeing it as a sort of, you know, they seem almost as a binary, superpower or nothing, rather than seeing it as actually as a spectrum. But secondly, to realize the extent to which, precisely because Russia is an authoritarian regime, the state doesn't have to worry about public opinion or whatever to anything like the same extent. It can do things, but we have to accept the limitations. Russia is still a weak country, a weak power, has no soft power. Its military power is pretty much tapped out now. The question becomes whether or not, with what is already on the table, it's worth talking to them. And I'd agree, absolutely, I'd say yes.
Just one quick point about the issue of Russian, Islamist militants, particularly from the North Caucasus, but not only in Syria and Iraq. My sense before the war, well, so there was this story, I actually don't know if it's true, Mark would probably know better than me, but that the Russian intelligence agencies had sort of set up what they called something like a green corridor, which was a sort of encouraging their militants to go that way, go to Syria, go die in Syria. And that they were actually relatively good about controlling the ones who were coming back. And despite a lot of concerns about a surge in terrorist incidents by Islamist groups leading up to the Sochi Olympics, that they'd basically gotten a handle on the whole Islamist movement, and that there was a reason to believe that they were in better shape, say a year ago or over the past year, than they had been in a long time. So as soon as this military operation happened, I go, well, that's going to change things, because basically, again, what they're doing is they're shifting the blame assessment. So who is before is basically the United States, maybe France, a few other whatever. And now the Russians. Now the Russians are in here killing lots of Sunnis, and now they clearly have now been targeted. So it was always from the beginning, if the goal was to reduce the threat of Islamist militants in Russia, I thought it was a crazy thing to do.
But, I mean, Islamic State has long been regarding Russia and saying that Russia is the enemy. And also, I mean, I think on this green... Depends where they're, I mean, they have different propaganda line. I mean, if you look at their Russian language stuff, it's obviously very different. But this Green Corridor thing, that was basically just very much a local, because, hey, this is Russia, there are quotas. It looks like some of the Russian security agencies in the North Caucasus were helping this because they thought, it's useful. It's not as if it was a policy from Moscow, I don't think. But anyway, that's the thing.
Thank you for the talk. I want to ask briefly about Putin's quotes that he made this week in the Russian media, where he claims that Turkey's reasons for bombing was to protect their oil trade with ISIS. And I was wondering if there's any evidence or if that played a role in what happened recently. And that's, I guess, to all of you, whoever can answer that.
Do you know about ISIS oil trade?
Well, oddly enough, I was just reading something the other day about one particular oil magnate, private business person in Turkey who has been funding and setting up an infrastructure to get oil out of northeastern Syria. The oil seems to go out of northeastern Syria into the Kurdish autonomous region in northern Iraq, and then from northern Iraq across Turkey through the Jihan pipeline that the United States was pushing so hard to build, out into the Mediterranean, and the primary market for that oil seems to be, wait for it, the State of Israel. So in fact, where ISIS's oil seems to be going primarily, where the income is coming from, is supplying something like 80% of the oil that Israel is importing right at the moment. That's some reporting that was done in the British press. But on the whole, though, the world oil market is one giant pool of oil. So once the stuff actually gets out into the international arena, it's really hard to figure out where it's exactly going. But there do seem to be Turkish billionaire private business people who are probably financing a good deal of the oil that's coming out of the Islamic State areas, both in Iraq and in Syria.
I mean, I think a lot more goes that way, but also, in fairness, one should mention that there seemed to have been at least some shipments by boat that actually went to Crimea. I mean, I think the trouble is, where there's business to be made, all other considerations tend to become much more secondary.
Yeah, I'm Richard Iaria with the LaRouche Political Action Committee, and I'd ask the panel, what they think the situation that you've just gone through in Syria, how that fits in with the more global picture in terms of the U.S.-Russia situation, greatly deteriorating. And Mr. LaRouche said that after President Obama accomplished his first regime change in Libya, that Assad was next. I mean, that was pretty straightforward. And Mr. LaRouche said that was really targeting Russia. And since then, we've had, just on the downing of the plane, Foreign Minister Lavrov said that, look, the United States, all these things have to be pre-cleared with the U.S. in terms of U.S. arms agreements, and the Deconfliction agreement had also similar types of arrangements in terms of our allies. So that's something pretty direct in terms of Russia and maybe a more strategic picture. The second thing is that you have a president that is with the new drone papers that have come out on the Intercept website, who I can you can look at him, but I have to draw the conclusion that he's effectively a mass murderer. And the question is, how is that situation, the deployment of the ABMs, the continued march of NATO, the situation in Ukraine where you had two towers blown up on the way to Crimea in terms of electricity, and we won't even touch on the China situation. But how does that, how does this fit in with the global situation where you have, I would say, a drive toward U.S.-Russia confrontation, and you have a mass murderer in the White House that's going to have to decide within seconds or minutes whether to do that or not?
I'm going to let Mark handle that one.
Okay, thank you. There's a poisoned chalice to sip from. Look, I mean, on the one hand, I'll be honest, I have been exceedingly unimpressed by this administration's handling of American relations with Russia. And that dates back to, during the Medvedev presidency, when briefly Putin sort of swapped offices with his prime minister. The White House treated this as something real and wooed Medvedev, not realizing that he was always the sock puppet. And in fact, you really want to be worrying more about the hand within it. And generally speaking, I mean, I think that on a variety of reasons, I haven't really got the time to go into the detail, I think this has been sort of poorly handled. But I think at the same time, one has to accept the extent to which we're now dealing with a very different Russia, a very different Putin. In his first two presidencies, Putin spoke ferociously nationalistically, but actually acted very, very pragmatically. He was a very rational actor who realized that actually Russia's future lay with some kind of positive relationship with the West. I mean, even probably in part mischievously, he raised the notion of actually Russia joining NATO, for example. Now we have a Putin who, one can play the psychiatrist's game and wonder why, but nonetheless, I mean, he seems to believe his rhetoric much more. He's informed by a much, much more narrow circle of advisors, and he seems to be much more concerned about his position in history as the sort of the gatherer of the Russian lands and so forth. So it's actually very hard to know how to deal with someone whose interests are increasingly antithetical to those, not just of the United States or the West, but also the existing international order. This is a guy who feels that the rules should not apply. And in that context, I mean, apart from the fact that if we're looking at mass murderers, I think there's, the Kremlin has a much greater say to sort of being getting that title. But essentially, I mean, we come back to the issues of containment. When it comes down to it, unless we're going to set out to try and bring regime change to Russia, which would be stupid and disastrous, and fortunately I don't think anyone seriously is, we're actually just talking about riding out the current spasm of post-imperialism. This is Russia acting up the way that, frankly, France and Britain acted up when they lost empires, but just in rather different contexts. So that I think would be my sort of general gloss, which may well not actually answer your points, but I wasn't quite sure I fully understood them. So.
Real quick, I find it remarkable. My sense is that the Obama administration runs foreign policy the way a professor would run American foreign policy, right? Thinking about all the problems, all the difficulties, exactly right, all of the unintended consequences that might come up. And so while Washington is sitting around thinking about all these unintended consequences, things happen, or other countries move. And the United States always seems to be sort of one step behind. I was really struck that after the attacks on Paris, the French president immediately embraced Russia. They talked about cooperating together, carrying out joint operations. The United States isn't at that stage at all, thinking about any kind of joint operations with Russia. It's 3 months behind the times.
I'll just ask real quick. But what about removing Obama to solve that?
So actually, let me just say I'm a slightly different take on that, in the sense that I am generally in favor of being careful in an increasingly dangerous world. I don't think. I mean, I think I think it's safe to say we overreacted to September 11th, and I suspect along is maybe overreacting to the Paris attacks, and we should probably take a deep breath and be careful, where he goes. Because it can have long-term consequences. So I'm in favor of being cautious.
Hello, Allegra Curiel, Mills College. Thank you for your insight today. I have a question concerning the role of Dabiq in the interior of Syria. Do you think that is a feasible military strategy? Who has power in Dabiq, the role of ISIS or the United States? Do you think we should be considering what kind of role the prophecy and the village itself has in the interior?
Yeah, thank you so much. If I may, let me just say a couple of words, please. And so there are some old Islamic prophecies that go back a long time that says that when the end of time comes, there will be a magnificent battle, a huge battle in northern Syria, in a little village, sorry, I'm shaking, just northeast of Aleppo, a little village called Dabiq, and this is where the Crusader armies will meet up with the Muslims, and the Muslims will prevail, but only at very great cost. So one of the very first things Islamic State did when it set up an administration and gained some power in northern Syria was send a group out to take over the village at Dabiq. And the online English language magazine of Islamic State is called Dabiq, after this village. So there's a very apocalyptic tinge. There's a very end of times kind of tinge to the Islamic State. And a wonderful book has just been published by Will McCants at Brookings called The ISIS Apocalypse, that teases out all of that apocalyptic trend in ISIS's program and ISIS's platform. So, you know, one of the things Islamic State is waiting for is for the Russians, and some of the apocalypse says these will be blonde-haired people coming from the Caucasus. So Islamic State's kind of waiting for the Russian troops to show up and mass around Dabiq so that this final battle can take place. And to the extent that the French and the Americans are blonde too, then there may be all kinds of reasons for Islamic State to want to draw ground troops in to have some kind of confrontation. This will be a wonderful recruiting device for Islamic State to actually have a pitched battle on the ground in northern Syria.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have some interrelated questions about the political dimension. Someone mentioned the idea of partition. Is a partition a likely outcome? And if it is, would it make sense to embrace that outcome now and direct our military strategy in terms of it so that an accommodation, a cooperation could be achieved with Russia to have as its goal the establishment of a rump state? So we could cooperate about that within geographical bounds. And then, on the other hand, it would allow us to redirect the activity of the various militias that are now fighting with each other. Instead of contesting for ultimate control of Syria as a whole, we could get them to contest about the boundary lines between the various states into which Syria would be partitioned. And it would clarify things with the Turks, and so on. So I wonder what you think of that.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I think partition is becoming a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. I mean, I'm struck that none of the groups in Syria think that partition is a legitimate outcome. None of them is pushing for it. Even the Kurdish administration up in the northeast is not calling for an independent state. It's calling for some kind of self-administered area inside Syria. None of the Christians in Syria want to break away and have a Christian community. I don't think the Turkmen community want to have a Turkmen area either. Syrian nationalism is deep. The sense of Syria as a unified but diverse community is pretty well entrenched. The conflict has become sectarianized, but I think once the conflict blows over, citizenship and identity as Syrianness may well come back. The vicious circle part, the self-fulfilling prophecy part is that as outside actors conceive of local politics in those terms, then the lines get drawn up and political parties get drawn up along those lines. And that's, of course, the lesson of U.S. policy in Iraq. The lesson of U.S. policy in Iraq is the coalition provisional administration goes in, decides to have proportional representation among religious communities, decides to acknowledge various political parties on the basis of religious organization, and so, surprise, surprise, Iraqi politics becomes religionized. Now in Syria, then, if outside actors decide, well, let's separate out the Turkmen from the Assyrians from the Druze, and let's have little statelets. The French tried this in the 1920s, by the way, and it didn't take. But if it happens again, then there may be these little statelets. One last thing, I'm droning on. In Syria, though, even more than in Iraq, the communities are really mixed. There's a Turkmen village right beside a Kurdish village, right beside an Ismaili village. And so if you thought Pakistan and India was problematic in 1947, partitioning Syria would just be someone already said, a mess.
Yeah, I mean, from my point of view, I suppose I can see a certain appeal to partitioning, but then again, as a Brit, drawing arbitrary borders in the Middle East just seems to come naturally. But again, I think unless one were precisely willing to then bring with it, in effect, ethnic cleansing, then these would become arbitrary ones. I think the thing is that really we have two, and often they're seemingly contradictory priorities. On the one hand, we just want to sort things out quickly and neatly now. We want an easy solution, and partition seems, again from the outside, and absolutely I'd agree with what you just heard, seems on the outside to be convenient, because particularly when one draws the maps and you take the majority population, it's easy to come up with these round sort of, it's like a TV screen. It's only when you look really closely that you see it's made up of lots of little coloured dots. From a distance, it looks like a nice, coherent picture. If just resolving something in a kind of quick and dirty way on the ground is the answer, then maybe partition has its appeal. But almost certainly then what happens 2 years or 2 months later. But the other issue is precisely finding some kind of long-term settlement. And the problem about that is it can only come from the Syrians. The rest of the world can help broker, secure, assist, support, can try and step in to deal with actively malign agencies such as Islamic State, who are clearly seeking to stir up tensions. But when it comes down to it, it's going to come down to something that will actually bring the Syrians together. And although they can all agree that they want to be Syrians, perhaps, what does that actually mean? What is the shape? What is the color? What is the complexion? What is the politics of a Syrian state? So, I mean, my final point is, in some ways, maybe the answer is actually something that unites the two. Some very loose coalition state. So this strong regional lender, governor, it's whatever, use whatever model you want, with a very weak state. Well, I suppose you could use America. With a very weak central government, might be able to do something, but you need to have extraordinarily strong protections for the communities within them. So when you've got that one village that is not in the same color, metaphorically, as those around them, that they're not suddenly going to be at risk of little micro-Syrian civil wars emerging.
So I'd just make, a distinction between, de facto partition and de jure partition. So, de jure partition mean like the international community comes in and says, okay, here are the borders, here are the new borders. And then, de facto partition, I basically think of as a, I'm perhaps slightly more cynical than Mark in the sense I think basically all borders in their origins are products of coercion, almost always, and often products of wars. So de facto partition is basically a settlement on the ground or a solution on the ground that kind of allows the fighting to end. And the problem in Syria is just so enormously complex. To say that it'd be, easy to partition Syria, just look at the map. Or look at, even worse, look at the battlefield map. Look at, if you could just draw a map of the areas that are controlled by different groups versus those that are controlled by, sort of coherent groups, like ISIS versus, we show these maps like a rebel zone. The rebel zone, as I said, there are 53 combat organizations in, the Aleppo battle alone. So, that rebel zone, if you just stop the fighting between the regime and everybody else and between ISIS and everybody else, that rebel zone would be an incredible mess. And so, in other words, partition in the sense of outside partition just opens up an enormous can of worms. I spent a lot of time growing up in Africa. In Africa, I often, tell my students, okay, you don't like these colonial borders, draw better ones. Figure out how you do it. It's impossible. Unfortunately, borders are not products of democratic elections or justice or whatever. They're the least worst outcome most of the time. And so, my view about Syria is I hope at some point there's some kind of balance that on the ground that allows the fighting to stop. That I don't think it's very likely for quite a while, but I think that ultimately is, what's going to happen, short of some huge external intervention, which I don't think is going to happen either. So.
Yeah, but I've got to say, I was struck by this over the last couple of days. The trend that we see is for those little militias that very jealously guarded their independence and refused to go under the command of the Free Syrian Army are now grouping together in larger amalgams in response to the Russian intervention.
Yes, I've seen that. Yeah.
The outside Russian intervention may well have this tremendous unintended consequence of having the little groups put aside their differences to combat the outside power. Maybe the Russians will actually produce a way forward without intending to do so.
Well, on that note, whether it's Chicken Little 2 or just a mess, please join me in thanking our panelists.